Hawthorne Hollow, a village so tidy and picturesque it seemed to have been assembled from a child's toy box, was preparing for its annual midsummer fete. Bunting fluttered between thatched cottages. The scent of warm scones drifted from the women's committee tent, and the parish green gleamed under a perfect June sun. It was the sort of day that allowed villagers to believe, briefly, that nothing wicked could exist in such a place. Miss Jane Marple, visiting her distant cousin, Mrs. Emmeline Harcourt, sat contentedly beside the croquet lawn, her knitting needles clicking a calm accompaniment to the gentle hum of conversation. She had arrived in Hawthorne Hollow only the previous evening, but already found herself observing those around her with the quiet attentiveness that came so naturally to her. Villages were much alike, in her experience. Whether St. Mary Mead or Hawthorne Hollow, there was always something simmering beneath the surface. Mrs. Harcourt, a brisk woman of formidable energy, bustled beside her. "Oh, Jane, you must see the raffle prizes this year. A silver tea set donated by Lady Alton herself. Quite magnificent, though between you and me, no one really wants it. Too much polishing." Miss Marple murmured agreement, though her gaze followed a young woman standing apart from the festivities. The girl, slender and pale, wore a blue muslin dress and held her gloved hands tightly clasped before her. She looked as though she expected something dreadful to happen. "That's Clara Whitcomb," Mrs. Harcourt supplied, noting her cousin's direction. "Sweet girl, but awfully nervous these days. Ever since her father died last winter, she's been quite, well, fragile." Before Miss Marple could inquire further, a sudden burst of laughter came from near the lemonade stand. A tall man with an athletic build and a swagger just a touch too practiced was regaling a small crowd with some anecdote. His dark hair, carefully oiled, glinted in the sunlight. "Mr. Lionel Drake," Mrs. Harcourt sighed. "New to the village, bought the old Linton estate. Too charming by half, if you ask me. I've never known a man to smile so much at women and so little at bills." Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. She suspected Mr. Drake was not nearly as carefree as he appeared. A man who smiled that broadly often had something to hide. The fete concerts began, the brass band striking up a slightly over-ambitious rendition of Rule Britannia. Children danced around the maypole, adults gossiped amiably. And for a while, Hawthorne Hollow basked in its own peacefulness. It shattered at precisely 4 minutes past 3. There was a scream, a high, piercing sound that sliced through the cheerful din. The band faltered. A trumpet blared a sour note before stopping entirely. People turned as one toward the source of the disturbance. Near the edge of the green, just beyond the rose arbor, a small crowd had formed. Miss Marple, despite her age, moved toward it with surprising swiftness, her knitting tucked neatly into her carpet bag. Mrs. Harcourt followed, breathing heavily. 2 women stood beside the arbor, trembling. One clutched her hand to her mouth, the other pointed shakily toward a patch of trampled grass. At first glance, it was nothing extraordinary, simply a dark shape lying face down among the roses. But the silence of the onlookers spoke volumes. Miss Marple stepped closer. A man lay sprawled on the ground, arms rigid as though seized by some violent tremor before falling. His jacket was rumpled, the left sleeve torn. The most striking detail, however, was his complexion, an unnatural shade of gray-blue. "It's Mr. Drake," someone whispered. "He was laughing and jesting only moments ago." A murmur swept the crowd. Miss Marple, her expression calm, observed rather than reacted. Something about the position of the body and the faint scent in the air, bitter, sharp, stirred the edges of her memory. The village constable, a stout man with ruddy cheeks, arrived puffing with effort. "Stand back," he ordered. "Give the man air, though it seems he doesn't need it now." A few people gasped. Clara Whitcomb, the pale young woman Miss Marple had noticed earlier, sank onto a bench, her face white as chalk. "He can't be," she whispered. "He can't be dead." Miss Marple, positioning herself beside her, gently touched her arm. "My dear, did you know Mr. Drake well?" Clara hesitated, biting her lower lip. "No, not well. He had spoken to me once or twice. That is all." Her voice wavered, betraying something more complex than indifference. The constable crouched beside the body, poked it awkwardly, and looked up with the expression of a man well out of his depth. "Looks poisoned," he muttered loudly enough for half the village to hear. "You can see his lips, poor chap. Almost black." A collective gasp followed. "Poisoned? At the fete? Who'd do such a thing? I never trusted that Mr. Drake, too slick by half." Miss Marple said nothing. But inside her mind, threads of thought already began to weave themselves into patterns. Poisonings were rarely impulsive. They required preparation, knowledge, and opportunity. And the victim, Mr. Lionel Drake, was a man who, in her brief observation, attracted envy, annoyance, flirtation, and resentment in equal measure. Mrs. Harcourt leaned in close, whispering urgently, "Jane, this is dreadful, absolutely dreadful. They'll shut down the fete, you know." And the vicar insisted everything must run smoothly this year. "Deaths," Miss Marple replied gently, "rarely accommodate social schedules." Then she turned her eyes back toward Clara Whitcomb, who was trembling, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Clara stared at the ground, refusing to look at the body, but Miss Marple saw something in her expression, not fear exactly, but a kind of dread, the dread of someone who had expected and feared an outcome very much like this one. Across the crowd, another figure observed silently, a woman in a tailored grey coat, her auburn hair arranged in tight waves beneath a modest hat. She stood ramrod straight, her gloved hands folded neatly, her gaze fixed on the scene with unnerving intensity. "Who is that lady?" Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Harcourt followed her gaze. "Oh, that's Mrs. Meredith Vale, a widow, returned to the village only last week after years abroad. Quite reserved. Rather mysterious, if you ask me." Two young men near the lemonade table began arguing, one insisting Mr. Drake had seemed perfectly healthy minutes earlier, the other swearing he saw him stagger just before he fell. A third whispered that Drake had been overheard threatening someone 2 nights ago at the pub. Gossip, Miss Marple knew, was the lifeblood of villages. And yet within the tangle of exaggerations and distortions, one could often find the threads of truth, if one listened carefully enough. The constable rose to address the crowd. "We'll need statements from anyone who spoke with the deceased today. No one leaves the green until I say so." A chorus of uneasy murmurs rippled through the gathered villagers. Hawthorne Hollow had plunged from cheerful festivity into communal panic in the space of only a few minutes. Miss Marple folded her hands primly, her expression serene amid the unrest. Another murder in another village, and behind it, she felt certain, lay a story of human frailty, concealed passions and secrets long kept in shadow. The kind of story she understood all too well. The stillness that followed Lionel Drake's collapse seemed to settle over the fete like a thin layer of frost. Sound returned in uneven bursts. Someone sobbing near the cake stall, the rustle of skirts as villagers shifted uneasily, the low murmur of hastily exchanged whispers. The band had fallen entirely silent. The drummer stood clutching his sticks as though afraid to move. Constable Briggs, whose natural preference was for minor disturbances and mislaid bicycles, cleared his throat with an air of reluctant importance. "Now then," he said, voice a little too loud. "There've been developments. Everyone remain calm. No call for panic." His plea for calm had precisely the opposite effect. A babble of speculation broke out at once. "Poison. He said it was poison. I heard there's foam at the mouth. That's what my cousin saw. Could have been his heart, you know." These modern men don't take proper rest." Miss Marple sat back on the wooden bench beside Clara Whitcomb, allowing the commotion to flow around them. Clara's hands were still clenched so tightly together that the knuckles shone white. "Here," Miss Marple said kindly, producing, as if by conjuring trick, a neatly folded handkerchief from the depths of her bag. "A little lavender, very good for the nerves. I find it helps when one has had a shock." Clara accepted it with a tremulous murmur of thanks. Her eyes strayed, in spite of herself, to the motionless figure on the grass. I saw him laughing only 10 minutes ago," she whispered. "He asked me. He insisted I try the special lemonade at his stall. I refused. I'm glad I did." "Oh, that sounds dreadful, doesn't it?" "Honest rather than dreadful," Miss Marple replied. "One cannot help one's relief at escaping danger. Did he press you strongly about the lemonade?" Clara hesitated. "Not strongly, but he did seem insistent, and he laughed when I said I preferred tea." "Always tea with you, Clara," he said, though he's hardly known me long enough to say always about anything. Miss Marple's needles clicked once or twice. No more. A brief resumption of rhythm while she tucked away that remark. "And did he often speak to you so familiarly?" "Not in public," Clara said, flushing. Sometimes when we passed on the lane, he would walk a little way with me. He asked about Father's will, whether the cottage would stay in my name. He said it wasn't right for a lady to manage such things alone." "Very old-fashioned of him," Miss Marple murmured. "And you did not happen to mention this to anyone, my dear?" "No," Clara said quickly. "It seemed unimportant." Miss Marple thought that the young often failed to distinguish between what was important and what was simply unpleasant. She gave Clara's hand a gentle pat, then looked up as Mrs. Harcourt swept toward them, agitation written in every brisk movement. "Jane, they're saying everyone who drank from that lemonade urn must be questioned. Honestly, I told Mrs. Vale not to sample it. Foreign travel, you know. One can't be too careful." But she only smiled in that quiet, superior way of hers and said she'd had worse in Cairo. Miss Marple's eyes flicked across the green to where Mrs. Meredith Vale stood. The widow had moved a little further back, under the shade of a hawthorn tree, watching everything with a composed, almost clinical interest. She spoke to no one, though several villagers had ventured near as if about to address her, then thought better of it. "It is often instructive," Miss Marple said softly, "to see who holds themselves apart on such occasions." "You mean she looks guilty?" Mrs. Harcourt whispered, eyes bright with the thrill of it. "I mean only that it is instructive," Miss Marple repeated mildly. At that moment, the vicar mounted the small wooden platform that had been erected for speeches and prize-giving. His naturally benign face was drawn with distress. "My dear friends," he began, "this is a terrible tragedy. Out of respect for Mr. Drake, we must of course bring the fete to a close. Constable Briggs will explain the practical arrangements." There was a collective sigh, half disappointment at the curtailed festivities, half relief at being told what to do. Briggs, hauling himself up onto the platform with less grace than the vicar, announced that everyone would be required to give their names and addresses. Those who had been near the lemonade stand, or who had spoken to Mr. Drake that afternoon, were to remain behind. "That'd be half the village by the look of it," someone muttered. Miss Marple, who had not so much as glanced at the lemonade, suspected that the poison, if it were indeed that, might not have been distributed in so democratic a fashion. It was very rarely that murderers risked killing a crowd when a single person would do. One by one, the stalls began to be dismantled. The cake competition table was hastily covered with a cloth. Children were shepherded home by flustered mothers who alternated between scolding them and pulling them close with unusual fervor. Near the bandstand, two men stood in fierce discussion, Dr. Kendall, the village doctor, and Mr. Charles Winthrop, the local solicitor. Kendall's thin face was set in professional gravity. "I tell you, Briggs is not wrong," he said. "The symptoms are consistent with some form of acute poisoning, violent convulsion, cyanosis, rapid collapse. But what caused it, I cannot say without a proper examination." Winthrop, a heavily built man with a florid complexion, looked almost offended. "Poison, in Hawthorne Hollow. It's absurd. Lionel was young, strong as an ox. If you'll permit me to say so, Doctor, I'm astonished you should speak so freely of such a thing. It will set the whole village in an uproar." "The village is already in an uproar," Dr. Kendall retorted, "and I speak as medically as I can. The man is dead. I cannot soften that. If it is poison, we must discover its source. I should like very much to know exactly what Mr. Drake ate and drank today." Miss Marple caught the words as she passed within polite distance. She paused, her eyes dropping momentarily to the trampled grass where a paper plate lay, smeared with what had once been lemon tart. "Jane, do come along," Mrs. Harcourt urged. "Briggs says we're to give our statements in the church hall. I must say, they could have chosen a more comfortable venue. Those chairs are simply horrid on the back." The crowd moved in a subdued procession toward the church. Inside the hall, trestle tables that had earlier displayed preserves and embroidery now served as makeshift desks. Constable Briggs sat at one end, surrounded by sheets of paper, looking as though he deeply regretted every career choice that had brought him to this moment. Names were taken, questions asked. Miss Marple, when her turn came, answered simply. She was a visitor, had been seated near the croquet lawn, had not known Mr. Drake personally. "You didn't speak to him at all, ma'am?" Briggs asked, pencil hovering. "Not directly," Miss Marple said. "I did, however, hear him speak. He was laughing loudly near the lemonade stand." "Everyone says that," Briggs grumbled. "Always the lemonade. You'd think he'd never touched anything else in his life." "Thank you, ma'am." She withdrew to a corner, knitting once more in hand. The repetitive motion soothed her, but her mind was alert, darting from one overheard fragment to another. "Owed me 3 months' rent. He did. Promised he'd invest in my brother's garage, then backed out. Said he'd never met my sister, but I saw them together in Marketbury only last week. Mr. Lionel Drake, it seemed, had not confined his charms to garden party banter. There were money dealings, vague promises of help, suggestions of influence in London. A pattern emerged, a man who had lived above his means, scattering easy words and vague assurances, gathering in small favors, invitations, confidences. Clara's name surfaced more than once, usually in hushed tones. Pretty girl, but not much money, poor thing. Hadn't any business walking with him on the lane. Another name appeared too, Mrs. Vale. He knew her from before. I'm sure of it. Why else would she come back just now? Miss Marple lifted her eyes. Mrs. Vale had finished her own brief interview and now stood by the door, waiting. Her posture was very straight, face unreadable. Only her hands betrayed any tension, fingers tightly interlaced over her handbag. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. Mrs. Vale inclined her head, the politeness of one stranger to another, then slipped out into the fading light. And that, Miss Marple thought, watching her go, is a woman who knows more than she intends to say, for the moment. The statements concluded. People began drifting away in 2s and 3s, voices low. The fete decorations still fluttered incongruously outside, bright ribbons and paper lanterns stirring in the evening breeze. As Miss Marple and Mrs. Harcourt walked back toward Harcourt House, the church bell tolled the hour, 6 o'clock. In windows along the lane, curtains twitched. The village had already begun its second occupation, interpretation. "You see, Jane," Mrs. Harcourt burst out at last, unable to contain herself. "It must be something to do with his past. Men like that don't just arrive in villages for nothing. And Mrs. Vale, mark my words, there's history there. I could tell from the way she looked at him." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed thoughtfully. People do not come together without reasons. They bring their stories with them, like trunks on a journey. Sometimes, I'm afraid, what is inside those trunks can be rather unpleasant. She spoke mildly, but her eyes were serious. Somewhere between the laughter at the lemonade stall and the sudden scream by the rose arbor, a hidden drama had played itself out, one whose first act had ended in Lionel Drake's death. And Miss Marple, who knew villages and their secrets as well as other people knew their own gardens, understood that Hawthorne Hollow had only just begun to reveal itself. The evening deepened into a soft indigo as Miss Marple and Mrs. Harcourt approached the tidy gate of Harcourt House. Lamps glowed warmly in nearby cottages, yet the quiet had a strained quality, a village holding its breath. Mrs. Harcourt unlocked the door and ushered her cousin inside with a bustle meant to disguise her unease. "I shall make tea at once," she declared. "A dreadful day, Jane, positively dreadful. I shan't sleep a wink unless I have a proper cup." Miss Marple removed her hat, smoothing a stray thread on the brim. "Tea is always sensible after a shock," she agreed. She followed her cousin into the sitting room, where lace curtains filtered the last of the daylight, and a small clock ticked punctually on the mantel. The familiar tranquility of a well-kept English drawing-room contrasted starkly with the tumult of the fete. Miss Marple sat near the hearth, hands folded neatly, her expression serene but thoughtful. As Mrs. Harcourt clattered about in the kitchen, Miss Marple considered what she had observed. Lionel Drake had been a man who excelled at making friendly acquaintances. Yet none of those friendships ran deep. Such people, she had long noticed, often built relationships the way some built houses of cards, impressive at first glance but dangerously lacking in foundation. And when they collapsed, it was usually sudden and complete. The kettle whistled shrilly. Mrs. Harcourt returned with a tray, 2 teacups trembling slightly on their saucers. "I do hope they'll get to the bottom of it quickly," she said as she poured. "The village can't go on like this. Mrs. Kilburn at the shop will have the crime solved before breakfast, if one listens to her. Honestly, she claimed she saw Mr. Drake slip something into his own drink, as though he'd poison himself at a fete." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Villagers do enjoy a theory, and they enjoy it all the more when it contradicts the constables." "Well, there is certainly no shortage of theories," Mrs. Harcourt said, sitting opposite her. "Some are saying jealousy, on account of that dreadful flirting he did. Others say debts, others claim he had enemies in London." She leaned forward. Clara Whitcomb looked positively ghostly. "I do hope she isn't mixed up in anything." "She looked frightened, yes," Miss Marple agreed gently. "But not, I think, because of guilt." Mrs. Harcourt blinked. "Whatever do you mean, Jane?" "Only that fear comes in many forms," Miss Marple replied. "Sometimes one is afraid for oneself. At other times one may be afraid because of something one knows or suspects about another." Before Mrs. Harcourt could ask more, a sharp rap came at the front door. She startled, nearly upsetting the sugar bowl. "Good heavens! At this hour?" Miss Marple rose. "Perhaps Constable Briggs has had a new development." But when she opened the door, the visitor standing beneath the porch lantern was not the constable. Mrs. Meredith Vale, immaculate as ever in her tailored coat, offered a polite nod. "Miss Marple," she said quietly, "may I speak with you? Alone, if possible." Mrs. Harcourt hurried forward. "Mrs. Vale, do come in. We were just having tea." Mrs. Vale stepped inside with graceful precision, though her eyes flickered with something guarded. Miss Marple gestured toward the sitting room, and Mrs. Vale seated herself on the edge of a chair, gloved hands resting on her handbag. "I apologize for calling so late," she began, voice smooth but low. "But after this afternoon's dreadful event, I believe certain matters should be clarified." Miss Marple sat opposite her, the firelight softening the lines of her face. She waited patiently. "I imagine," Mrs. Vale continued, "there is already some speculation about my connection to Mr. Drake. Rumours thrive quickly in places like Hawthorne Hollow. Yes, Miss Marple said mildly. Villages do tend to draw conclusions, though not always the correct ones. Mrs. Vale exhaled a quiet breath. Then allow me to offer a few facts before the gossip twists them. She hesitated. I did know Lionel Drake. Many years ago, before I married Mr. Vale. Mrs. Harcourt let out a tiny gasp. We were acquainted during a period when I was impressionable, Mrs. Vale said, choosing her words carefully. He was charming, persuasive, but I discovered, rather too late, how unreliable he was. Dishonest, in fact. He left England abruptly, owing money to several acquaintances, myself included. It was an embarrassing matter, though I managed to keep it from becoming widely known. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but she watched the woman closely. And his appearance here in Hawthorne Hollow, was it coincidence? I believe so, Mrs. Vale said, at least at first. I had returned only a week before he arrived. I thought perhaps he would avoid me. Instead, she paused, jaw tightening. He wrote to me, 2 days ago, asking to speak privately. He implied he had information that might interest me. Something from our past. Mrs. Harcourt leaned forward. Breath held. I declined, Mrs. Vale continued, and I did not meet him. You must believe that. Whatever happened today, I had no involvement. Miss Marple considered this quietly. People who have been wronged, she said gently, do not always seek revenge, but others might assume they do. Mrs. Vale's composure wavered for the first time. Exactly. I do not wish the police to interpret my past acquaintance with Lionel as motive. It was long over. I have nothing to hide. Miss Marple gave a small, kind nod. Then you have done the sensible thing by speaking plainly. Mrs. Vale rose, smoothing her gloves. Thank you, Miss Marple. And please be cautious. Lionel Drake was not merely charming. He was dangerous in subtle ways. He made people believe things, promised things, and he collected secrets. When she had gone, Mrs. Harcourt sank into her chair. Well, I never. Such a revelation, and she's so dignified. Jane, what do you make of it? Miss Marple poured herself a fresh cup of tea. I think Mrs. Vale is accustomed to guarding her pride, she said softly. People who have been deceived often are. But if she didn't meet him, Mrs. Harcourt said, and she didn't want anything to do with him, why would he summon her here with that letter? That, Miss Marple said, is an interesting question. The night drew on. After Mrs. Harcourt retired upstairs, still muttering about secrets and letters, Miss Marple remained by the fire, knitting untouched in her lap. She reviewed Mrs. Vale's explanation, the frightened look in Clara Whitcomb's eyes, the heated conversation between Dr. Kendall and Mr. Winthrop, and the curious scent that had lingered near the body. Sharp, bitter. At last she rose, extinguished the lamp, and climbed the stairs to her room. But sleep did not come easily. She knew from long experience that the first day of a crime was like the first stitch in a piece of knitting. If incorrectly placed, the whole pattern might go awry. Morning in Hawthorne Hollow began with a chorus of bird song that struck an oddly cheerful note after the grim tumult of the fete. Miss Marple descended to breakfast to find Mrs. Harcourt already pacing by the window. Oh, Jane, it's all over the village. Briggs has found something. Some item near the lemonade urn. They're saying it proves a woman was involved. Miss Marple halted mid-step. What sort of item? A handkerchief, with initials, C.W. Mrs. Harcourt pressed a hand dramatically to her heart. Clara Whitcomb. Miss Marple stood very still. The sunlight from the window caught the fine lines around her eyes, but her expression was calm. A handkerchief, she said softly, is a curious thing to leave behind at a murder. Mrs. Harcourt stared at her. Jane, surely you don't think. I think, Miss Marple said gently, that someone may be trying to lead the investigation, and the question is not who dropped the handkerchief, but who wished it to be found. She moved toward the door, her step brisker than usual. For now, Emmeline, I believe it is time I paid a visit to Clara Whitcomb. The lane leading to the Whitcomb cottage curved gently between hedgerows, heavy with early summer bloom. Morning sunlight filtered through the leaves, mottling the path with shifting patches of gold. Hawthorne Hollow was already awake. Gardeners pruning roses, children darting between gates, and women leaning over fences in pointed conversation. Yet each person Miss Marple passed offered her the same quick, darting glance. Curiosity mingled with apprehension. News of the handkerchief had spread like wildfire. The Whitcomb cottage appeared at last, modest but well kept, ivy trailing neatly around the window frames. Clara was visible through the front window, sitting stiffly at a small wooden table, her hands clasped around an untouched cup of tea. When Miss Marple knocked, Clara startled so violently that the cup rattled against its saucer. "Oh, Miss Marple," she gasped as she opened the door. I didn't expect anyone so early." "I hope I am not intruding, my dear," Miss Marple said warmly. "But I thought a friendly visit might be welcome. These must be trying hours for you." Clara's pale face tightened in gratitude and fear at the same time. "Please, come in." Inside, the cottage had the faint scent of lavender polish, though the tidy arrangements on shelves suggested a young woman doing her best to maintain what had once been her father's pride. Clara motioned toward a chair, then sat opposite, twisting a handkerchief, another plain one, through her fingers. "I suppose you've heard," she whispered. "Everyone has. That handkerchief they found. Mine. I lost it during the fete. But I didn't know. I didn't know it was near the lemonade." "Losing things at large gatherings is very common," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "A handkerchief, after all, is easily dropped. But they think I left it there intentionally. And Constable Briggs said he will have to ask more questions. Miss Marple, I didn't go near the lemonade stand after I refused Mr. Drake. Truly, I didn't." Miss Marple studied the girl's trembling hands. Clara's fear was not the fear of guilt. It was the fear of implication, something she had seen before in other villages, in other tragedies. "I believe you," she said softly. "But you must tell me, did you see anything unusual near the lemonade? Anyone lingering? Anyone who oughtn't have been there?" Clara exhaled shakily, eyes fixed on the pattern of the rug. "I don't know. After I spoke with him, I walked away quickly. But I glanced back once. Someone was stepping into the space I had left. I only saw the back of them. A woman, I think, wearing grey." Miss Marple's brows lifted ever so slightly. "Mrs. Vale, I'm not sure. It could have been. But the fete was crowded. Many wore grey." Clara hesitated. "Miss Marple, there's something else." The ticking of the small mantel clock punctuated the silence. "I didn't tell the constable this," Clara said, voice trembling, "because it sounds foolish, and because I can't bear the thought of more suspicion. But 2 nights ago, I found a note pushed under my door." Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. "A note? May I see it?" Clara rose, went to a small desk, and retrieved a folded slip of paper from a drawer. She handed it over with reluctance, as though the object itself unsettled her. Miss Marple opened it carefully. The handwriting was sharp and slanted. "Meet me at the fete on Saturday. We must speak. I know things about your father's affairs you cannot ignore." The signature was simply L.D. Miss Marple read the note twice. Then, with great care, she placed it back on the table. "My dear, this is not foolish at all. It is very important. Why did you not show it to Constable Briggs?" "Because it makes me look guilty," Clara whispered. "As if father left debts or secrets and Mr. Drake held them over me, and I didn't go to meet him. I would never have agreed to whatever he wanted." Did your father have affairs that might interest Mr. Drake? Clara shook her head emphatically. Father was a school teacher. He had a modest pension, nothing unusual. But Mr. Drake took an interest in your inheritance, Miss Marple said quietly, recalling Clara's earlier remark. He asked about the cottage. Yes, and it frightened me. I thought he wanted something, but I don't know what. There came the sound of brisk footsteps outside. Clara stiffened. A moment later, a firm knock sounded on the door. Clara looked at Miss Marple with dread. "It will be Constable Briggs," she whispered. Miss Marple gave her a reassuring nod and opened the door. Indeed, the constable stood there, cap in hand, expression apologetic, yet determined. "Morning, Miss Marple. Miss Whitcomb, I'm afraid I must trouble you further. Just routine. We've had some developments, you see." He stepped inside awkwardly. His eyes flicked to Clara, then to the note lying on the table. "And what might that be?" Clara flushed scarlet. Miss Marple intervened smoothly. "Merely a personal letter Clara received earlier in the week, but perhaps it is relevant now." Briggs lifted the paper, squinting at it. "Well now, that does change things." Clara let out a small cry. "Please, Constable, I didn't answer him. I didn't meet him." Briggs held up a placating hand. "No need for distress, miss. It only shows Mr. Drake was importuning you. That's not your fault, but I must ask, did you tell anyone about this letter before today?" "No," Clara whispered. Miss Marple observed Briggs carefully. He seemed less inclined to suspect Clara now, though he handled the matter with a stiffness that suggested he had already been chastised for jumping to conclusions regarding the handkerchief. "Well," Briggs said, clearing his throat, "the inspector from Marketbury is coming this afternoon to assist. Until then, we're simply gathering information. I'll need to take this note." He folded it into an envelope. "We must consider all possibilities." Miss Marple nodded. "A wise approach." Briggs gave a relieved sigh. "Thank you, Miss Marple. It's a muddle, that's what it is. A proper muddle." After he left, Clara sank onto the chair again, looking utterly defeated. "Miss Marple, everything seems to point to me." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "Appearances, my dear, are often arranged by someone who wishes to avoid notice themselves. A handkerchief does not walk to a crime scene. A letter does not make you a murderer. If anything, Mr. Drake appears to have been tugging at threads of people's pasts. Yours, Mrs. Vale's, and perhaps others." Clara looked up anxiously. "Do you really think someone is trying to frame me?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that Mr. Drake had more than one person who wished to avoid his attentions, and one of them may have been clever enough to create a trail that leads away from themselves." Clara swallowed hard. "What should I do?" "Only be truthful," Miss Marple said, "and calm. Panic never serves innocence." She rose, retrieving her handbag. "And now, Clara, I believe I must take a walk. There are two people who may shed light on Mr. Drake's recent activities. Dr. Kendall, who saw him last, and Mr. Winthrop, who knew something of his financial dealings." Clara looked frightened again. "But what if the real killer knows you're asking questions?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear, I have found that people rarely pay much attention to an elderly woman who knits. It is one of life's small advantages." Outside, the sun had risen higher, burning off the last traces of dawn haze. Miss Marple closed the gate behind her and began down the lane with a sense of purpose. The pattern was forming, uneven, incomplete, but unmistakably there. Someone in Hawthorne Hollow had feared Lionel Drake. Someone had reason enough to silence him. And Miss Marple, with her quiet steps and sharper insight, intended to discover exactly who. Miss Marple walked with measured steps along the lane, each footfall steady but purposeful. The morning breeze stirred her scarf as she approached the village green, now stripped of its cheerful decorations. The trestle tables had been stacked aside, the bunting removed, albeit in only a few trampled rose petals remained to hint at the previous day's festivities. It looked almost forlorn, as though the village itself had not yet recovered from the shock. Near the center of the green stood Dr. Kendall, hands in his coat pockets, staring at the patch of grass where Lionel Drake had fallen. His thoughtful frown softened when Miss Marple approached, though the fatigue beneath his eyes suggested a sleepless night. "Miss Marple," he said, offering a polite nod. "Not out for a morning stroll, I suspect?" "Not entirely," she replied. "I wondered if I might trouble you with a few questions. I know you examined Mr. Drake yesterday. You mentioned signs of poisoning." Dr. Kendall's lips thinned. "Yes, though without laboratory confirmation I can only speculate. The discoloration around the lips, the rapidity of the collapse, it points to something fast-acting, but what precisely, I cannot yet say." Miss Marple considered this. "And you did not observe any wounds? Nothing to suggest he had been injected or scratched?" "No. His skin was untouched, apart from the abrasion on his sleeve. Likely from the fall." Dr. Kendall paused, gaze sharpening. "You're thinking of an applied toxin, something delivered in contact?" "Only wondering," she said mildly. "Poisons come in many varieties, some subtle, some crude. A person who wished to avoid detection might choose the former." Dr. Kendall sighed. "If that's so, then our culprit is either unusually well informed or unusually desperate. Perhaps both." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the nearby table where the lemonade urn had stood. "Tell me, Doctor, did you notice whether Mr. Drake's hands smelled of anything unusual? Oils, chemicals, bitter scents?" He shook his head. "Nothing I recall, but I wasn't looking for that." He hesitated before adding, "Mr. Drake seemed in perfect health earlier yesterday. I saw him several times this week. He came to inquire about vitamins of all things. Hardly the request of a man expecting danger." "Unless," Miss Marple said gently, "he believed he had already avoided it." Dr. Kendall gave her a startled look but said nothing. She thanked him and continued down the lane, leaving him deep in thought. Her next destination, the solicitor's office, lay just off the high street. The small brass plaque outside read, "Charles Winthrop, Esq." She knocked, and after a moment, the door opened a crack before widening to reveal Winthrop himself, still florid, though his expression was distinctly nervous. "Miss Marple," he said, smoothing his waistcoat, "if this is about yesterday, well, I suppose all conversations lead back to it now." "Only a few questions," she said pleasantly. "May I come in?" He ushered her into a narrow room lined with tidy stacks of papers. Everything about the space suggested meticulous order, except for Winthrop's own agitated pace as he circled behind his desk. "I told Briggs everything," he muttered. "Drake owed me a minor sum. Quite minor, and he assured me he would repay it soon. I know how it looks, but I assure you I had no quarrel with him." "Of course," Miss Marple said agreeably. "I'm sure many people had dealings with Mr. Drake. He seemed a man fond of making arrangements." "Arrangements," Winthrop huffed. "That's a polite word for manipulation." "He coaxed money, favors, introductions, always with promises that never quite materialized." "And yet," Miss Marple said, "people continued to trust him." Winthrop looked embarrassed. "That's the thing about charming rogues. They make you feel foolish for doubting them." He paused, lowering his voice. "Between us, Miss Marple, Drake hinted at some profitable investment opportunities, foreign ones. He claimed I might be suitable to assist with the legal side. I suspect now that he exaggerated everything. But at the time, well, he presented himself convincingly." Miss Marple nodded. "Did he make similar offers to others?" "I believe so. I know he spoke to Mr. Hensley at the post office, and he approached young Peter Yardley about investing in machinery. He spread his net wide. But deeper ties? Any hint of blackmail?" Winthrop stiffened. "Blackmail? Good heavens, no. Or at least, nothing I personally witnessed. But he had a way of implying he knew more than he said. I cannot deny that. Miss Marple thanked him for the information, rising from her chair. Winthrop, still pink-faced and uneasy, opened the door for her. "Miss Marple," he called as she stepped onto the pavement, "I don't suppose you think, well, that this was some kind of revenge for those dealings, that someone grew angry over money?" "Money," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "is a motive people often understand. But I find that the strongest motives usually grow from more personal roots." She left him blinking after her. The next part of her walk took her past the old oak near the crossroads. There, leaning against its trunk and smoking a cigarette with exaggerated nonchalance, stood Peter Yardley, the young mechanic. He straightened when he saw her. "Morning, Miss Marple. Off about the village?" "Indeed," she said. "And how are you this morning, Peter?" He shrugged, though his foot tapped anxiously. "Strange business, all of it. I heard Briggs found a handkerchief, and suddenly everyone's pointing fingers at Miss Whitcomb. Ridiculous. She couldn't harm a fly." "I quite agree," Miss Marple said. "You knew Mr. Drake, did you not? He spoke to you about an investment." Peter flushed. "Yes. Said he had connections in a motorcar firm. Promised he could get me a good deal on equipment, said I only needed a little capital up front. I didn't believe him. Well, mostly didn't. But he kept insisting." "Did his insistence trouble you?" Peter tipped ash from his cigarette. "He cornered me the night before the fete. Told me he'd make me regret it if I didn't take the offer. I thought he was joking, but—" He looked away. Maybe he wasn't. Miss Marple absorbed this quietly. "Did anyone overhear this conversation?" "Only Mr. Hensley, perhaps. He came out of the shop just as Drake was walking away. Gave me a strange look, too, like he was thinking something he didn't want to say." "Thank you," Miss Marple said softly. "You've been very helpful." As she continued down the lane, her mind pieced together the morning's revelations. Lionel Drake had left behind trails of debts, of broken promises, of veiled threats. But beneath those outward signs lay something more precise, more deliberate. He had contacted Clara Whitcomb. He had written to Mrs. Vale. He had implied knowledge of secrets. And now she had learned he had attempted to coerce a young mechanic as well. Yet not one of these threads felt quite central. She approached the small bridge over Hawthorne Brook, pausing there as the water rippled below. The sunlight caught the surface, scattering it with glints like tiny coins. Miss Marple rested her hand on the rail, her expression thoughtful. Someone had used the fate for a very specific purpose, not merely to rid themselves of Lionel Drake, but to create a particular impression afterward. A man poisoned in a crowd, a handkerchief belonging to Clara, a letter implying private meetings. And yet, Miss Marple reflected, such staging often revealed more about the murderer than about the victim. As she turned toward the village shop, intending to seek out Mr. Hensley, she noticed a figure approaching from the opposite path. Mrs. Vale, poised, composed, yet walking with a slight stiffness that betrayed tension. She stopped when she reached Miss Marple, her expression unreadable. "I was hoping I might find you," she said quietly. "There is something else I did not mention last night. Something about the letter Lionel wrote me." Miss Marple met her gaze with gentle curiosity. "Yes, my dear." Mrs. Vale glanced around to ensure no one else was near, then lowered her voice. "He claimed he knew why I returned to the village, but I came back only to settle my late husband's estate." She hesitated. "At least, that was the official reason." "Official reasons," Miss Marple said kindly, "are very often only part of the truth." Mrs. Vale swallowed. "I believe Lionel Drake intended to use my past to control me, and I believe someone else knew what he intended." Miss Marple studied her closely. "Someone else?" "Yes," Mrs. Vale exhaled. "Someone who feared what Lionel meant to reveal." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "And do you know what that revelation might have been?" Mrs. Vale did not answer directly. Instead, her eyes drifted toward the far end of the village, toward a house half hidden beyond a row of trees. Miss Marple followed her gaze, and in that moment, a new thread aligned neatly with the others. "I see," she murmured. "Thank you, Mrs. Vale." As the widow walked away, Miss Marple remained on the bridge a moment longer, the pattern sharpening in her mind. Not complete, not yet, but clearer than before. Someone in Hawthorne Hollow had much to lose if Lionel Drake spoke freely, and that someone, Miss Marple was now certain, had already begun to weave misdirection with deliberate care. Miss Marple lingered only a few seconds longer on the bridge before resuming her walk, her steps unhurried, yet directed as though she were following a thread only she could see. Mrs. Vale's parting implication had settled into her thoughts with the quiet force of truth. Not the full truth, perhaps, but enough to confirm that Lionel Drake had been meddling in matters that did not concern him. And in doing so, he had stirred into motion someone who preferred their past firmly buried. The village shop bell jingled as she entered. The shelves smelled faintly of peppermint drops and brown paper, and behind the counter stood Mr. Hensley, a thin man with spectacles perched precariously on the tip of his long nose. He was sorting envelopes when he saw her and straightened immediately, as though anticipating the purpose of her visit. "Good morning, Miss Marple. A very grim time for the village, very grim indeed. I suppose you've come about yesterday's business." "Yes," she said, stepping closer. "I thought a word or two might be helpful. I understand you were near the post office when Mr. Drake had a conversation with young Peter Yardley." Hensley adjusted his spectacles. "Saw them from the doorway. Drake had that tone. Smooth, coaxing, then sharp as vinegar when he didn't get his way." The lad looked troubled. "And did you overhear anything?" "Only the ending. Drake said something like, 'You'll wish you'd listened.' Rather theatrical, if you ask me. The boy stomped off afterward. But he's a good lad. Hot-headed, perhaps, but not one for poison." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I find that poisoners tend not to be hot-headed. They are cold, patient, and often calculating in character. Anger expresses itself in far messier ways." Hensley nodded, visibly reassured. "Exactly so. But if you ask me, Miss Marple, Drake had more than one person on edge. Why, the morning before the fete, he collected a parcel from here. Foreign postmark, Cairo, I believe. Addressed simply to him at the Linton estate." "Cairo," she repeated softly. "Aye. Strange thing, though," Hensley went on. He seemed unusually pleased to receive it, tucked it under his arm like a prize. But when he stepped outside, he opened it straight away and went quite pale. Stood there staring at the contents. "What were the contents?" Hensley hesitated. "I couldn't see exactly. But there was a paper, several pages, I think, and something small wrapped in cloth. Whatever it was, he slipped it into his pocket and left in a hurry." Miss Marple absorbed this. A letter from Cairo, connected perhaps to Mrs. Vale's years abroad, and something small enough to be concealed in a pocket, something that unsettled Lionel Drake enough to rattle even his polished facade. "Thank you, Mr. Hensley. That is most helpful." As she left the shop, her thoughts lingered on the foreign parcel. If Lionel Drake had intended to use information from Cairo to pressure Mrs. Vale, then someone might have feared what he had received there, and fear, Miss Marple knew, was a potent catalyst, sometimes more dangerous than anger. She had gone only a short distance when she heard hurried footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Constable Briggs jogging toward her, breath coming in puffs. "Miss Marple, thank goodness I found you," he said, wiping his forehead. "The inspector has arrived from Marketbury. Inspector Talbot wants to speak with you." Miss Marple held back a polite sigh. Inspectors rarely sought her out for her convenience. They wanted clarification, names, insights. Talbot, she recalled, had a reputation for brisk efficiency and not much patience. "Of course," she said. "Where is he now?" "At the Linton estate. He's begun his formal inquiries there." The estate stood on a rise overlooking the village, its tall gables and narrow windows giving it an austere elegance. Miss Marple followed Briggs up the winding drive, her sharp eye taking in details: the unmended shutter hinge, the gravel disturbed by more than one hurried step, the faint scent of varnish from a newly replaced window frame. A house revealed much about its inhabitants, particularly those who lived beyond their means. Inside, Inspector Talbot was questioning one of the estate servants, a nervous young man who wrung his cap in his hands. Talbot, tall and severe, looked up as Miss Marple entered. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, as though he had anticipated her appearance exactly. "I've been told you were present when the victim collapsed." "Yes," she said modestly. "I was sitting near the croquet lawn." Talbot gestured to a nearby chair. "I'd like to go over your observations. You have a reputation, Miss Marple, for noticing details." She sat, folding her hands neatly. "Inspector, I shall be glad to help, but I fear I saw only what everyone else saw." Mr. Drake laughing one moment and collapsing the next. "Constable Briggs tells me you believe the handkerchief to be a planted clue." Miss Marple permitted herself a soft smile. "I merely observed that young women rarely embroider their initials on handkerchiefs, only to scatter them carelessly. And if Miss Whitcomb disliked Mr. Drake's attentions, as I have reason to believe, she would be less likely than most to hover near him." Talbot grunted in reluctant approval. "Just so. And there is another matter, the contents of Mr. Drake's study." Briggs, looking flustered, indicated the open door. Miss Marple entered first, her gaze sweeping the room. Papers lay strewn across the desk, though their disarray felt purposeful rather than chaotic. Someone had searched, but neatly, selectively. On the far corner of the desk lay a half-open drawer. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly. "May I?" Talbot permitted her with a stiff nod. Inside the drawer were letters, several addressed to Lionel Drake in various hands. One envelope bore the Cairo postmark. Miss Marple lifted it gently. It was empty. The inspector noted her expression. "Whatever was in that envelope is gone, taken before we arrived." Miss Marple set the envelope down. "Then someone knew exactly what they sought." Talbot crossed his arms. "And who would that be?" Miss Marple turned to face him. Her expression was composed, almost serene, but her eyes were sharp with certainty forming. "I think, Inspector, that someone feared what Mr. Drake might reveal, and that someone entered this room either during the fete or shortly after his death. They took what they needed to conceal, before the police could arrive." Talbot frowned. "Do you propose a name?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. She walked to the study window and looked out over the village, where rooftops glinted beneath the sun, peaceful and unaware of the secrets brewing beneath them. "A name," she said gently, "will come in due course. But first, Inspector, I believe you should speak to Mrs. Meredith Vale again, and perhaps to Mr. Winthrop and Peter Yardley." "You think they are involved?" "I think," Miss Marple said, turning back with quiet emphasis, "that they are entangled, but involvement and guilt are two very different things." Talbot looked dissatisfied but intrigued. "And you, Miss Marple, what will you do?" She smiled mildly. "I shall continue to observe. People often reveal themselves most clearly when they believe the worst suspicion has passed them by." And as she left the study, Miss Marple knew the murderer was already adjusting their next move, perhaps emboldened, perhaps desperate. The game was unfolding exactly as such people preferred, but unfortunately for them, Miss Marple had already begun to see the full pattern emerging. Inspector Talbot remained in the study a few moments longer, issuing brisk instructions to Constable Briggs about cataloguing the remaining papers. Miss Marple quietly withdrew, her steps soft across the corridor's polished floorboards. She felt no need to debate with the inspector. Men like Talbot preferred the illusion of control, but she knew the true answers would not come from the desk of Lionel Drake. They would come, as they so often did, from the small cracks in people's stories, from the tremor of a hand or the choice of a word. And she had already seen several such cracks. Outside, the late morning sun had grown warm. A faint breeze carried the scent of flowering lime trees from the estate grounds. Miss Marple followed the gravel path down toward the gate, turning everything she had gathered over in her mind. The foreign parcel, Mrs. Vale's troubled composure, Clara's ominous note, Peter Yardley's threat, Winthrop's embarrassment, all pieces, but not yet arranged to reveal the picture. She paused near the side of the house. A gardener, an elderly man stooped by a flower bed, was trimming the lavender bushes with slow, precise motions. Miss Marple recognized him from the fete. He had manned the plant store, though he'd been far too shy to speak much. She considered passing by, then decided otherwise. "Good morning, Mr. Dilly," she said quietly. He straightened, wiping his brow with a sleeve. "Morning, ma'am. Dreadful business, dreadful. Never saw anything like it in all my years here. You've worked at the Linton estate a long time, I believe." 42 years come Michaelmas," he said with a touch of pride. "Though this Mr. Drake, well, he wasn't like the Lintons, ma'am. Not by a long stretch." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. People of a certain nature are often careless with the trust they're given. "Tell me, Mr. Dilly, did Mr. Drake keep much company at the estate?" "Company?" he snorted softly. "Visitors, yes, plenty of them. Not friends, though. Men with sharp suits and sharper words, and once or twice, women who looked like they didn't want to be seen." "Women?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Aside from Mrs. Vale?" He blinked, startled. "Oh, no, ma'am. Mrs. Vale never came here. I meant someone else. Came 2 days before the fete. Late afternoon. Dark-haired lady, nervous-like. Asked to see Mr. Drake. They argued. Loud enough I heard it through the garden door." "Argued?" Miss Marple's tone remained light, but her pulse sharpened. "Do you recall anything said?" "Not much, ma'am, only that she kept saying, 'You promised you wouldn't.'" And he laughed at her, but not kindly. Told her she was in no position to beg favors now. "And did she say her name?" "No, ma'am, but he called her 'my dear Margaret,' that I remember. Hard to forget when someone says something so unpleasant in a mocking way. Margaret. No such woman had been mentioned by anyone. No Margaret on the fete planning committee, none among the villagers Miss Marple had observed, none in relation to Lionel Drake's recent dealings. A new thread, unexpected, but potentially the missing one. "You're very observant, Mr. Dilly." "Thank you," she said, offering him a kind smile. He flushed with shy pleasure and returned to his trimming. As Miss Marple left the estate grounds, she replayed the gardener's words. Margaret, frightened, desperate, arguing with Drake, and Drake mocking her as he mocked so many. Who was she? And why had she come in secret? A woman with something to lose, something Drake held over her. Perhaps a clue lay not in who she was now, but who she had once been. The sunlight dimmed suddenly as a shadow crossed her path. Mrs. Harcourt, walking briskly from the direction of the post office, waved her handkerchief. "Jane, there you are. I've been hunting for you. The village is buzzing. They say Inspector Talbot is convinced Clara Whitcomb has something to hide. Utter nonsense, if you ask me, but he's telling everyone her handkerchief was practically under the lemonade urn." Miss Marple gave a soft sigh. Poor Clara. Accusation often sticks to the most timid people simply because they do not know how to brush it off. Mrs. Harcourt fell into step beside her, lowering her voice. "And there is more. Mrs. Vale has been seen speaking to the inspector already." They say she admitted she once knew Mr. Drake in her younger years. Honestly, the way gossip travels. Gossip, Miss Marple said gently, often contains small truths tucked between larger distortions. But you can be sure the inspector will judge her sharply. Men in official positions sometimes resent anyone withholding information, even when that information concerns private shame rather than crime. Mrs. Harcourt nodded vigorously. Indeed. And Jane, what of that parcel from Cairo everyone's whispering about? Mr. Hensley wouldn't tell me a thing. That, Miss Marple said, is precisely why we must determine whom the contents frightened. Lionel Drake, certainly, but someone else too. They reached the center of the village just as a commotion arose near the library steps. Constable Briggs stood there, red-faced and flustered, attempting to calm a small crowd that had gathered. Miss Marple approached at once. "What's happened?" she asked softly. Briggs ran a hand over his hair. "Another development, Miss Marple. Hardly know what to make of it." "What sort of development?" He pointed to a small satchel resting on the library's stone landing. "Found this sitting right there. No one claims it. Inside were papers, Drake's papers, letters, receipts, something that looks like a bank statement. And this." He held up a folded scrap of parchment, yellowed but intact. Miss Marple didn't need to touch it to know it was old, older than Lionel Drake's schemes or even his arrival in the village. The edges were worn, the ink faded. "What does it say?" Mrs. Harcourt asked breathlessly. Briggs cleared his throat. "Seems to be part of a will, or a land deed. Hard to say, names are smudged. But it's tied to Hawthorne Hollow, very old. And someone wanted it found?" Miss Marple's breath stilled. Not out of surprise, but recognition. A land deed, an old one. Something Drake received from Cairo, perhaps. Something that tied Mrs. Vale's past to Hawthorne Hollow. Something that involved Clara's father, or someone connected to him. Something worth killing to stop. "Inspector Talbot will want this immediately," Briggs said, already gathering the satchel. Miss Marple lightly laid a hand on his arm. "Constable, may I see the parchment for a moment?" Reluctantly, Briggs handed it to her. She unfolded it with care. Though faded, a few words were still legible. Transfer of property, rightful heir, concealed correspondence, not to be revealed without. And at the bottom, a signature, blurred but with one initial unmistakable. M. Margaret. A chill passed through Miss Marple. Not of fear, but of certainty. She folded the parchment and returned it to Briggs. "Inspector Talbot must handle this, yes, but, Constable, it would be wise to keep the satchel secure. Very secure." Briggs nodded, puzzled. Miss Marple stepped back, her expression calm though her thoughts raced. The threads were weaving into a single tapestry now. The land deed, the secret past, the mysterious woman Margaret, Drake's blackmail, and two women in the village whose lives had intersected with his in ways not yet fully admitted. As she watched Briggs hurry away, Miss Marple knew one thing with unmistakable clarity. The murderer had not only silenced Lionel Drake, they were now trying to guide the investigation away from themselves and toward someone innocent, and very soon they would make a mistake. Miss Marple watched the departing constable until he disappeared around the bend, the satchel tucked protectively under his arm. The small crowd dispersed in murmurs, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves in the early afternoon breeze. Mrs. Harcourt looked as though she might burst with questions, but Miss Marple touched her hand gently. "My dear Emmeline, I must ask you to return home for now. There is much to reflect upon, and distracted minds too easily draw dangerous conclusions." Mrs. Harcourt blinked, perplexed but compliant. "If you insist, Jane, but do be careful. Whoever planted that satchel may still be lurking about." Miss Marple gave her a reassuring smile, though inwardly she had no doubt of it. As her cousin departed, Miss Marple turned toward the library steps. The satchel had been placed too deliberately, too publicly, to be accidental. Someone wished for the parchment to be found, but only after removing whatever tied it irrevocably to them. She walked a slow circle around the library, eyes scanning the ground, the hedgerows, even the window ledges. Nothing obvious presented itself, but Miss Marple rarely expected blatant clues. Criminals were rarely careless in their actions, only in their assumptions. She continued along the lane, heading toward the brook again, allowing the rhythm of her steps to encourage clarity. The afternoon light glittered between the branches overhead. The village, outwardly calm, felt taut beneath the surface, like a violin string stretched too tightly. Conversations halted when she passed. Curtains twitched. Fear, false suspicion, these were dangerous things to let loose among neighbors. Halfway to the bridge, she noticed someone sitting on the bench beneath the great chestnut tree. Peter Yardley, shoulders hunched, stared at the ground as though the earth itself might hold answers. Miss Marple approached, her presence soft enough not to startle him. "You seem troubled, Peter," she said gently. He looked up sharply, then relaxed slightly when he saw her. "Miss Marple, I'm just thinking. Everything's gone wrong since yesterday. People are saying things about Clara, and now about Mrs. Vale. They're claiming Drake was mixed up in some inheritance business." His jaw tightened. "If people start pointing fingers at Clara, I won't stand for it." "You care for her," Miss Marple observed softly. The young man's flush confirmed what she had already sensed. Well, yes, but that's got nothing to do with this. She's being dragged through the mud for nothing. Yet someone is working very hard to make her appear involved," Miss Marple agreed. "Which tells us the murderer fears exposure and hopes the village will accept the simplest explanation." Peter's brow furrowed. "But why Clara? Why not someone else?" "Because," Miss Marple said, "she's vulnerable. A young woman alone, grieving her father with little means to defend herself. Such people make convenient scapegoats." Peter clenched his fists. "Then we need to find proof. Something to clear her." Miss Marple gave him a warm, approving smile. "And we shall, though sometimes, Peter, proof lies not in what is present, but in what is conspicuously absent." He looked puzzled, but she didn't elaborate. Instead, she continued down the lane, heading now to the place toward which Mrs. Vale had cast her meaningful glance earlier that day. A house tucked discreetly behind a row of sycamores, larger than Clara's cottage, smaller than the Linton estate. The brass knocker shone with recent polish. She knocked lightly. It was a minute before the door opened. Mr. Hensley, the postmaster, stood there, not in his apron this time, but in a housecoat, as if surprised by visitors during his off-duty hours. "Miss Marple?" he said, startled. "Is something the matter?" "Not at all," she replied warmly. "Only a small inquiry, if you don't mind. You mentioned that foreign parcel Mr. Drake received. I wonder, did he ever send anything in return? Letters, perhaps?" Hensley stiffened. "Not much, but enough to catch Miss Marple's eye. Can't say I noticed. He posted one or two things, I suppose. Nothing unusual." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "One's memory is often clearer when one is at ease. Let us not tax yours. Instead, might I ask, did he speak to you at all when he collected the parcel? Did he ask questions about its origin?" Hensley swallowed. No. Took it and left. Seemed preoccupied." "That is interesting," Miss Marple murmured, "because Mr. Drake was not a man who received troubling information quietly." Yet he said nothing. Hensley's gaze flicked past her, toward the street. A small movement, small enough that another person might not have noticed, told Miss Marple that he feared being overheard. "Forgive me," she said gently. "I won't keep you. But should anything else come to mind, you will find me quite easy to speak to." As she stepped back onto the path, Miss Marple felt the faintest tremor of certainty. Mr. Hensley had not lied, but he had not told the whole truth, and his reluctance suggested something personal, something entangled. She continued on, letting the pieces align further. She thought of the parchment, the missing contents of the Cairo envelope, Margaret's hidden visit, Mrs. Vale's fear, Clara's distress, Hensley's hesitation. Drake had been threading himself into old matters, long sealed away, perhaps too old for some to believe they could resurface, until they had. The call of the church bell startled her from her thoughts. It told the hour, 4 o'clock, and as its resonance faded, Miss Marple noticed someone striding quickly toward her from the direction of the market square. Inspector Talbot. He reached her with the expression of a man who has stumbled upon a new complication rather than a solution. "Miss Marple," he said curtly, "I've been looking for you. Another witness has come forward, claims to have seen Mrs. Vale near the lemonade stand after all. I'm going to question her again." Miss Marple regarded him with calm patience. "And you believe this witness?" Talbot hesitated. "It matches earlier hints." "It matches what someone wants you to believe," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Inspector, you must tread carefully. The murderer is clever enough to redirect suspicion toward two women who, in truth, have far more to fear from Mr. Drake's death than motive to cause it." Talbot frowned. Then who, Miss Marple, would benefit from weaving such a pattern? She gave him a serene, almost grandmotherly smile. "Why, Inspector, the very person whose name has been delicately absent from every conversation? The one who was close enough to observe everyone's movements, yet unremarkable enough to escape attention." Talbot looked startled. "You have someone in mind." "I have a suspicion," she corrected softly. "But suspicions are not proof. Proof requires patience." Before Talbot could press her, a cry echoed from the end of the lane, a woman's cry, piercing and frightened. The inspector spun at once. Miss Marple followed with a measured, steady pace, though her heartbeat quickened. They reached the source of the cry. A woman stood trembling near the edge of the brook, pointing down the sloping embankment. Miss Marple followed her gaze. A small object lay half hidden among the reeds, glinting faintly in the filtered sunlight. Talbot descended first, lifting it carefully with a handkerchief. It was a small glass vial, its cork missing, but a sharp, bitter scent still clung to its rim. Miss Marple inhaled softly. A poison vial, thrown hastily away. And the murderer, she knew, had just begun to lose their nerve. Inspector Talbot held the vial aloft with a kind of grim triumph, though his eyes betrayed uncertainty. The thin glass caught the afternoon light, refracting it into cold little shards across his palm. Miss Marple watched him descend carefully back up the embankment, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path. "A poison container," Talbot announced, drawing the small crowd's breath into a collective gasp. "Thrown away in haste. Someone panicked." Miss Marple inclined her head, though her gaze drifted past the inspector toward a set of faint impressions in the soft earth. Footprints, partly smudged by water, but with just enough definition to suggest haste. Not the careful steps of someone concealing a crime, but the frantic movements of someone who feared discovery. "It is interesting," she said gently, "how fear and guilt rarely produce the same patterns of behavior. A guilty person hides evidence with precision, but a frightened one—" She gestured faintly toward the brook. "They make mistakes." Talbot frowned, unsure if she was implying innocence or cunning. The murderer must have thrown it after hearing the search was widening. Or, Miss Marple added softly, after realizing someone else had begun to suspect them. Talbot's eyes flicked toward her. "You seem very certain there's more here than meets the eye." "Oh, yes," she said, smiling kindly. "I often find murderers reveal themselves not in their actions, but in their reactions." Talbot looked unsettled, but before he could question her further, Constable Briggs came rushing down the lane, breathless and flushed. "Inspector, you must come at once. There's been a break-in at the parish office." Miss Marple felt a small tightening along her spine. "A break-in?" Briggs nodded vigorously. "Yes, ma'am. Papers scattered everywhere. The vicar says someone was looking through old parish records." "Old records," Talbot muttered. "Connected to property deeds?" "Seems likely," Briggs said. "One of the cabinets was forced open." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with the inspector. Inspector Talbot, whoever broke in was not searching for random documents. They were seeking to erase or confirm something very specific. "Connected to that parchment you saw?" he asked. "Undoubtedly." Talbot turned sharply. "Briggs, secure the site. No one enters until I arrive." As the constable trotted off again, the inspector motioned for Miss Marple to follow. "You as well, Miss Marple. You may notice something the rest of us miss." She moved beside him without hesitation. "If I may make an observation, Inspector, criminals usually believe destroying a single document removes all trace of their secret. But secrets, particularly those involving old property rights, rarely exist in only one place." Talbot shot her a sideways look. "Then our perpetrator is foolish?" "Not foolish," she corrected. "Desperate." They arrived at the parish office, its wooden door half open with visible marks where a screwdriver, or perhaps a knife, had been forced between the panels. Inside, the vicar wrung his hands, looking utterly undone. "Inspector, such a mess has never happened in Hawthorne Hollow. The place is ransacked. Oh dear heaven, I can't imagine who would—" "We shall try to determine that, Reverend," Talbot said, stepping past him. Miss Marple surveyed the room. Papers lay scattered across the floor, many relating to small church matters, marriage bans, birth notices, minor land tithes. But a section of shelving near the back had been cleared entirely, leaving a stark, empty rectangle of space. "The historical ledgers," the vicar whispered in explanation. "They contained land records from over a century ago, family holdings, transfers, disputes, some of them very old. I kept them in perfect order." "And now?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Gone," he said miserably. "All gone." Talbot strode to the cleared space, jaw tight. "This ties directly to the parchment Briggs found. Someone does not want their connection to certain lands, certain inheritances, revealed." Miss Marple lowered herself gracefully onto a chair and looked at the vicar with gentle concern. "Reverend, do you recall whether the Whitcomb family or the Vale family had any historical claim tied to these lands?" The vicar blinked, then frowned with effort. "Well, yes, I suppose. The original records noted some boundary disputes involving a Whitcomb ancestor. And the Vale family, well, they lived abroad for years, but before that, yes, they were tied to the same parcels." Talbot looked sharply to Miss Marple. "This bolsters the suspicion against them." But Miss Marple shook her head. "On the contrary, Inspector, this suggests someone wishes to implicate them further. A true culprit avoids drawing attention toward themselves. What we are seeing is a campaign, deliberate and increasingly frantic, to paint a particular picture." Talbot paused, absorbing this. At that moment, a soft cry came from the doorway. Clara Whitcomb stood there, pale and trembling, gripping the frame as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. I heard there was trouble," she whispered. "People are saying the break-in is connected to Father's old records. Oh, Miss Marple, they think I had something to do with it." Miss Marple rose at once, laying a steady hand on the girl's arm. "Clara, my dear, you must not listen to idle talk. Whoever is doing this wants you to feel cornered." Clara's voice quavered. "But why?" "I've done nothing wrong." "Precisely," Miss Marple said gently. "That is why you were chosen. You're easy to frighten, and frightened people sometimes make mistakes. That is what the murderer hopes for." Clara swallowed hard. "Miss Marple, Is it true that Mr. Drake had some claim against our property? Something he meant to reveal? Miss Marple hesitated only a heartbeat. He believed he did. Whether it was true or not remains to be seen. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Then someone might have thought Father hid something, or that I knew of it. And that, Miss Marple said, is exactly the line of reasoning the murderer wants the inspector to follow. We mustn't oblige them. Talbot cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the emotional display. Miss Whitcomb, you should return home. We will speak further later. Clara nodded shakily and hurried away. When she had gone, Talbot turned back to Miss Marple. You say someone is planting evidence, steering suspicion. Who, then, has the most to gain? Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. That depends, Inspector. One must always ask, who suffers most if the truth about old land deeds comes to light? Who holds a position convenient for observing the comings and goings of the village? Who knew when the parish office would be empty? Who saw Mr. Drake receive his parcel? Who had opportunity to search his study? And then the parish? Talbot frowned. You don't mean... Miss Marple nodded gently. Yes, Inspector. I fear the person we must consider most seriously is someone who has appeared harmless, someone who sees everything and is trusted. A soft knock sounded just then. Mr. Hensley stepped into the doorway, wringing his hands. I'm terribly sorry, he stammered. But I remembered something about that parcel Mr. Drake received. Talbot's eyes widened. Miss Marple's expression remained serene. The moment has come, she thought, when fear begins to undo the murderer far more effectively than suspicion. And she waited, watching Hensley closely as the next piece of the puzzle prepared to reveal itself. Mr. Hensley stood in the doorway like a man caught between flight and confession. His face was pale, his hands restless, and his eyes fixed not on Inspector Talbot, but on Miss Marple, as though seeking permission to continue, or perhaps absolution. Talbot gestured sharply. Well, out with it, man. You said you remembered something. Hensley swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. It's about the parcel Mr. Drake received, the one from Cairo. His voice shook slightly. I didn't tell you everything earlier. I forgot something, or thought it unimportant. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Memory often returns when one is ready to face it. Hensley seemed to cling to her calm tone. When Mr. Drake opened the parcel outside the post office, he looked shocked, but then he looked directly at me and smiled. Not a friendly smile, almost triumphant. And he said, Interesting to know who inherits what, isn't it, Hensley? Inspector Talbot stiffened. He said that to you. Why didn't you report it sooner? I thought he was teasing, Hensley said miserably. He teased everyone, and I didn't want to be mixed up in it. But now, with the break-in and the parchment, I fear he meant something very specific. Talbot exchanged a look with Miss Marple. Do you know of any connection between yourself and these land deeds, Mr. Hensley? Any family ties? Hensley hesitated too long. Far too long. Miss Marple stepped forward gently. Mr. Hensley, secrets are like wounds. They fester when hidden, but heal when exposed to the light. His shoulders sagged. Very well. My mother, before she married my father, was a Whitcomb. Distant, mind you, but the name appears in some old records. Mother always said it meant nothing, that the land disputes were settled long before our time. And yet, Miss Marple said softly, Mr. Drake implied he had discovered otherwise. Hensley lowered himself into a chair, burying his face in his hands. He told me 2 nights before the fete, after he'd had a few drinks, that he'd found proof of an old inheritance error, that some property rightfully belonged not to the Vales, nor to the Whitcombs, but to another branch. My branch. At least partly. Talbot frowned. That seems a strange claim to kill a man over. But Miss Marple shook her head gently. Not if Mr. Drake intended to use this information to manipulate Mr. Hensley, a quiet, observant man, trusted by the whole village. Someone who might feel cornered, burdened by the possibility of losing his place, or of being exposed as holding rights he never sought. Hensley looked up sharply, eyes wide. No, that's not true. I never wanted anything. I told Drake to leave it be. And yet, Miss Marple continued softly, when Drake threatened to reveal it, you feared the consequences. For yourself, for the village, perhaps even for Clara. For if the land was misallocated generations ago, it would tangle all three families. The scandal alone would be ruinous. Talbot leaned forward. Are you suggesting, Mr. Rubb, Hensley committed murder? Miss Marple did not look away from Hensley. I am suggesting he felt trapped. Drake had something over him, something he could not face becoming public. Hensley's breath came fast, uneven. You don't understand. If people believed I'd concealed inheritance rights, if they thought I'd allowed Clara to struggle or Mrs. Vale to return in fear, they'd hate me. They'd think I'd been dishonest all my life. Fear makes people do foolish things, Miss Marple said kindly, even to destroy records long forgotten, even to plant evidence. But murder, her voice gentled further, that requires a colder resolve. Hensley looked at her, trembling, waiting for condemnation or forgiveness. Miss Marple sighed softly. Mr. Hensley, you did not kill Lionel Drake. Talbot jolted. Miss Marple, what are you saying? She turned to the inspector, her voice firm. Mr. Hensley panicked after the death. Not before. He searched Drake's study because he feared what Drake had uncovered. He broke into the parish office in desperation to destroy proofs he imagined were there. But none of that shows calculation. It shows terror. Hensley nodded rapidly, tears brimming. Yes. I was terrified. I thought Drake's papers would expose everything. I thought I'd be blamed for stealing land or hiding records. I never touched the lemonade stand. I swear it. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. I believe you. Poison requires preparation, knowledge, and intent. You had none. But someone else did. Talbot exhaled sharply. Then who? We're running in circles. Not circles, Inspector, Miss Marple corrected softly. We are narrowing our path. She stepped away from Hensley, her voice pitched so only Talbot could hear. Consider who had the most to lose from these land revelations. Not Clara. She had no power. Not Mrs. Vale. She was misled but not implicated. Not Hensley. He inherited nothing and wanted even less. But a person who relied on village stability, who built their life around their perceived place, who could not bear the thought of losing respect. Her eyes swept the room, then widened, just barely, as a realization crystallized. Inspector, she murmured, where is Mr. Winthrop? Talbot blinked. The solicitor. I assume he remains at his office. Miss Marple shook her head. Mr. Winthrop, who knew about the land disputes, who had access to old deeds, who understood legal vulnerabilities, who admitted Drake promised investment opportunities and then reneged, and who, Inspector, would immediately recognize the value and danger of a rediscovered inheritance claim. Talbot stared at her. You think Winthrop killed him? Miss Marple's expression grew grave. I think Mr. Winthrop was the one person Drake could truly ruin. Not with gossip, not with flirtation, but with paperwork. The solicitor's reputation is his livelihood. The slightest implication of mishandled land claims or hidden ancestral rights would destroy him. Talbot's face hardened with sudden comprehension, and he had access to every type of poison kept behind his office cabinet. Rat powders, weed killers, tinctures. Miss Marple nodded. And the knowledge to use them discreetly. Before Talbot could issue orders, the parish office door banged shut. Hensley flinched. Miss Marple turned sharply toward the window and saw, through the wavering glass, a stout figure striding away down the lane. Winthrop. Talbot cursed and lunged for the door, shouting for Briggs. But Miss Marple remained still for a heartbeat, her eyes following the fleeing man with quiet sorrow. "Fear," she murmured, "has finally driven him to reveal himself." The moment Inspector Talbot and Constable Briggs rushed after Mr. Winthrop, Miss Marple followed at a calmer pace, her steps steady on the lane. She knew well that a cornered man rarely thought clearly. And Charles Winthrop, solicitor and respected figure of Hawthorne Hollow, had just realized the walls of his careful life were closing around him. Talbot sprinted down the lane, Briggs puffing behind him, shouting Winthrop's name. The solicitor did not look back. He hurried toward the disused mill road, a place where few villagers walked and fewer still would witness a desperate act. Miss Marple turned down the same path, unhurried but certain of where he would go. She found him standing at the edge of the old stone bridge, hands braced on the railing, chest heaving. His face was red, but the sheen of fear made him look older, smaller. "Mr. Winthrop," Miss Marple said gently, stopping a few feet away. "Running will not help you." He turned sharply, eyes wide. "You don't understand, Miss Marple. You don't understand what Drake intended to do to me." "I understand more than you think." Her voice was soft, but firm. He discovered that the Vale and Whitcomb land dispute was settled incorrectly years ago. A solicitor's error. Your predecessors, or perhaps even yours. Winthrop flinched. "I didn't know. Not until Drake showed me. He said he had proof that would ruin me, disgrace my office, drag my family name through the mud." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "And he used that threat to blackmail you." Winthrop's laugh was bitter. "He wanted money, position, influence, and when I refused, he said he'd expose everything to the village, make a public spectacle of my incompetence. I begged him to reconsider. He mocked me. And so you killed him." The words were not accusatory. They were simply true, set gently in the air between them. Winthrop sagged against the railing. "It wasn't meant to happen at the fete. I brought the poison in case things got worse. But he confronted me by the lemonade stand, told me he'd found more documents, waved them in my face. Said the whole village would know by sundown." Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. "And you slipped the poison into his cup?" "Yes," Winthrop whispered. "Only a few drops. Enough to silence him before he ruined everything. I thought it might look like a sudden attack. A weak heart, perhaps. But he collapsed too quickly. And then everything spiraled. The handkerchief, the satchel. I tried to direct suspicion away from myself, but it only made things worse." "It always does," Miss Marple said softly. "Deception grows tangled far faster than truth." Behind them, hurried footsteps approached. Talbot and Briggs at last. Winthrop saw them and straightened, shoulders stiff, resignation settling over him. He held up his hands, voice cracking. "It's over. I won't run anymore." Talbot grabbed his wrist and secured the handcuffs, reciting the arrest with grim professionalism. Winthrop did not resist. He walked away between the inspector and the constable like a man relieved to surrender to the inevitable. Miss Marple watched them go, her expression sorrowful but composed. The village returned to a cautious quiet that evening. Lanterns glowed behind lace curtains as supper dishes clinked and murmured conversations drifted between neighboring cottages. At Harcourt House, Mrs. Harcourt set tea before Miss Marple with a mixture of awe and indignation. "To think, Jane, Mr. Winthrop, of all people the solicitor, why, he prepared my husband's will. Terribly respectable." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Respectability, my dear Emmeline, is rather like the veneer on a piece of furniture. Attractive enough, but it does not always reflect the grain beneath." Mrs. Harcourt huffed, then sighed. "Poor Clara. At least her name is cleared now. "Yes," Miss Marple said warmly, "and Mrs. Vale will find some peace as well. She did not deserve the shadow Mr. Drake cast." "What a dreadful man he was," Mrs. Harcourt muttered, "causing trouble even after his death." Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. Human nature rarely changes, even in death, but one must also remember, desperation does not make a villain of everyone. Sometimes it makes victims of those who simply fear the truth. Her cousin blinked thoughtfully, then nodded. Later, as dusk settled over Hawthorne Hollow, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting resting in her lap. The soft murmurs of the village drifted around her. Someone laughed faintly. A dog barked. Life, in its imperfect but persistent way, was returning to normal. She watched a moment longer, then rose and prepared for bed, reflecting quietly. Evil seldom arrives with a dramatic flourish. More often, it grows in silence, in fear, in pride, in small deceptions, and sometimes, tragically, in the desperate desire to preserve a reputation. But human goodness, too, has its quiet strength. And Hawthorne Hollow, though rattled, would endure. As she extinguished the lamp beside her bed, Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest smile. "Yes," she whispered into the quiet room. "Human nature is always a puzzle, but every puzzle has its pattern." And with that gentle certainty, the village slipped into night, restored once more, though forever touched by the secret that vanished at midnight.